Now, to the title, People Who Live in Glass Houses Should Not Throw Stones, this is, of course, an allusion to some of the debates that we've been having at the global level on trade policy. Trade policy has become much more fractious ever since maybe 2008 onwards, when it became necessary to start blaming some countries for the failure to be able to complete global trade talks. And that blame game morphed into another type of blame game about different types of economic systems and subsidies. And so I want to tell you the story of that evolving blame game. And I'm going to do something which I know is deeply unacceptable, is I'm going to relate the story to underlying facts. And this is very counterintuitive, I know, and sometimes it's deeply offensive, but I'm actually going to highlight the findings of my team that has been collecting information since 2008 on over 50,000 different policy interventions by governments around the world. And that's the Global Trade Alert, which is mentioned there. And what we will be doing is to find out, try and answer the following questions, okay? When you look not at what's going on at the global level or the regional level, but at what governments are actually doing, what have they been doing, right? It was interesting when Caroline presented her story of the rise of globalization, and she had that chart on the left which showed going from, I think, 1980 up to the current day. Every single event on that chart was related to either a global trade development or a regional trade development, not a unilateral one, okay? And as I'm going to argue, unilateral trade policy has been like the ugly little sister, which has been overlooked largely and came back to bite us in the last 10 years as the area of contention. So what have countries been doing? Okay. And have countries been taking us towards more freer, more liberalized trade, or towards more distorted trade, or maybe a bit of both, and what's the mix? That's the second question. The third question is going to be relating to some profound shocks that we've had to the system, which is the Trump administration trade policy as well as COVID-19. How much did they matter compared to the underlying build-up over time of what governments were doing anyway? So we'll reflect on that. Then, to bring it even closer to the current debate, I'm going to talk about who are the good guys in the trade policy debate. We, at the moment, the way that things are framed, especially since over the last year, there's been a framing of democracies versus autocracies, with the implicit implication that the democracies are the good guys, the autocracies are the bad guys. So in trade policy terms, well, who are the good guys? And I'll show you some results there. And lastly, I'm going to step back and try and draw out the implications for the future of globalization. So that's what I want to do in the time that I have with you today. Now, just to clarify things, there are 3 levels to trade policy, and starting at the global level, we have a series of global trade rules which are codified at the World Trade Organization, and these rules pretty much tell governments what they should and should not do at the national level. Now, some countries have gone much further and have signed bilateral or regional trade deals. NAFTA, USMCA is an example of that. So you've got a regional layer too, which also has implications for what countries have to do at the national level. But at the bottom of the pyramid always is what national governments choose to do, or what some trade people call unilateral measures. What do they choose to do? Okay. Now, for much of my career, the top 2 levels received most of the attention. So I first went to Washington in 1993 when NAFTA was being negotiated and enacted. So that's the regional level. Then after that, we had the creation of the WTO in 1995. So that's the multilateral level. If anyone had told me that that would be the high point and that the rest of my career would be dealing with the decline in this system, I might have changed fields, but who knows? Still, I stuck with it. And so we ended up dealing with these top 2 levels. And at the bottom level was the one which was always a bit overlooked. Okay? And there were good reasons for this, because no one really collected much data on what governments were doing there. The really obvious data they collected was on taxing imports. Tariffs. And there's a mini industry of people who collect data on government investigations about dumped imports and subsidized imports. So that stuff was all well collected, but all the other forms of unilateral trade policy were not collected for a number of reasons which I've listed here. The first is policymakers realized that if the spotlight was on tariffs, then the way to help a local industry was not to use tariffs. Right? There's a clear incentive to use non-tariff measures, non-transparent measures. The second thing is that governments, once they were using these measures, had no incentive to declare them to the WTO, or at least to do so with a lag and to do so imprecisely. The third incentive out there was that if you're a staff member at the World Trade Organization, your bosses, your shareholders, are government. So are you going to go and collect information, awkward information about what your shareholders are doing? No. You just sit there waiting for them, the governments, to report or notify what they're doing. So they had blunted incentives. As for we professors, well, we prefer to download data than collect it. Let's face it. You just write more papers, you get more stuff done, let someone else collect that data. So we didn't contribute much either. And then as the story, because you can guess where this story is going, once the data started coming out and more thoughtful and intelligent diplomats in the trading system realized that things were going wrong, even then they were reluctant to talk about it because they didn't want to be seen to be undermining the rules in the system that they had all supported. And that's you can understand that motive even if you don't pursue that track yourself. And then the last reason which I want to come to is that once it became clear that governments were using lots and lots and lots of unilateral measures, then the glasshouse syndrome arose, which is that countries like, let's take a fight between Argentina and Brazil. Argentina is upset about something that Brazil has done to hurt its exports. But Argentina could run off to the WTO and complain about this, but Argentina knows that Brazil knows that Argentina is messing with its exports. Right? So there's a bit of tit for tat going on here. And both, so if you're sitting in Buenos Aires, you think, well, I could complain, but then I'm going to be litigated against as well. And if you're in Brasilia, you're sitting here thinking, well, the Argentinians aren't going to complain because we've got the goods on them too. Okay? So you end up in a situation then where you have lots of building up of unilateral measures and fewer WTO disputes. And we see that actually quite strongly in the data. So you have this hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil dynamic, which evolved with respect to unilateral actions and policies, which I'm going to show you the data for. This created a huge problem. Because all of the reasonable people were in denial about these unilateral measures or wouldn't admit that they were going on, it opened the door for people like Donald Trump to come in and say, hey, all these other countries are using unilateral measures, they're using subsidies, they're using stuff, they're screwing us, and this WTO organization, they're not collecting any information about it, they're not doing anything about it. And so by denying this, the three monkeys, we opened the door to the populists who then put their finger on this and said, hey, the system's broken, okay? And then once it becomes convenient later, and I'll explain that, then only then do we come back and say, okay, there's an underlying problem here that we need to discuss. So the unilateral trade policy of countries was very much underreported, and it had, I think, a very adverse systemic consequence. Let me show you some results. So let me explain the background to this. My team collects information on what governments do, and we try and collect very granular information so we can link, if a government gives a subsidy to a local firm, to the products that that firm sells, and then to whether there's any import competing firms which compete with them. So we can track over time how much imports or trade is in products and in markets where some firm has been subsidized, or some firm has received some other type of protection, a tariff increase, one of these Buy America provisions that you heard talking about earlier, all of that stuff. And so what we can do is track over time whether or not that shares of world trade covered by trade distortions has gone up or down. We started our work on the 1st of November 2008, when the G20 pledged not to do any protectionism. And then what we did is track over time how much trade was covered by trade reforms, the good news, or trade distortions. Now, you may remember at 2008, we had a global financial crisis. And everyone understands in the world trading system that when you have a crisis like this, you expect countries to respond, and there may be some subsidies, there may be some bailouts, but everyone understands that the deviations from the rules are temporary. So when we started, we expected to see, yes, there would be more trade covered by trade distortions, but then it would dip down again as the emergency came over. So we'd go back to normal. So it's a bit like an elastic band which you stretch, and then the crisis is over and it returns to its original level. So we were expecting to find a peak and then a trough, okay? Instead, what we found, if you look at the red line here, is a growth, systematic growth over time in the share of world goods trade that is covered by trade distortions. And this share rises up to about 49% before Donald Trump starts his trade war. Okay? So you can see that this deterioration in behavior in the trading system had started well before then. Now, unfortunately, or I should say fortunately, there was also trade reform, but by the time we get to the trade war starting, only a quarter of world trade has benefited from some type of trade reform, whereas half has been distorted by subsidies, tariff increases, and the like. So the balance is all in the wrong direction. Now, let me just talk a little bit about the dotted lines at the bottom. Those are, if you followed the conventional wisdom in the trading system and you didn't talk about all this other stuff, you only talked about those transparent policies that everyone was measuring, then the shares of world trade covered by transparent policy interventions were much smaller, and the amount of measures which were opening markets exceeded the share of global trade where markets were being, market access was being threatened. So the fact that the dotted green line lies above the dotted red line led defenders of the WTO to say, hey, Simon, there's no problem. But that's because they were looking in the wrong place. They were looking at tariff increases. They were looking at import quota changes. They were not looking at subsidies. And the gap between the dotted lines and the solid line equivalents, especially the red line, this is all made up of subsidies. Okay? And that is essentially what has happened. So when Donald Trump campaigned for the presidency and he said the world trading system is being distorted more and more by subsidies and the WTO hasn't got a handle on it, sorry, he was right. That's about the only thing you'll get me agreeing with him on. But he was right on this, okay? And it exposed a blind spot from those of us who wanted to support the system, because many of us had denied that there was a problem because we believe the official dotted line statistics at the bottom, okay? And that, I think, is what has happened. Now, the other thing, of course, you've seen over time is that the shares of global trade which are affected by trade distortions, the red line has grown and it's kept growing. Now, you've probably noticed there isn't a big jump when the trade war starts with China. The trade war covers between 4 and 5% of world goods trade, but a lot of US-Chinese bilateral trade was already covered by trade distortions before the trade war, actually. And so, yes, the trade war had an impact on bilateral trade, but there was already a lot of US-China trade tension which had already manifested itself in trade distortions. Likewise, when you come to the COVID era, the very fact that we don't see big jumps here in trade distortions created by subsidies pretty much tells you that the subsidies given during the COVID era were in the same sectors that had always received them. So it was just mutually reinforcing what's going on here. So what we saw over time is a different picture from that of the official organizations, and largely because we were looking in different places. All right, so this tells you that the system was going, sadly, in the wrong direction. Now, the question then is, okay, if these world averages are increasing, who's responsible for increasing them? And at the moment, it's very popular to say, well, look, there are autocracies, democracies, and that the trading system is fracturing between them. So you can look at that problem in a very empirical way. And what we did was to separate out China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, which are often associated with autocratic forms of government, and compare it to EU and the G7, which are associated with liberal democracies. And you can plot the share of goods imports covered by trade distortions in the autocracies, that's the red line, and in the democracies, that's the black line. Now, it's true that the red line lies above the black line, so the autocracies are behaving more badly, yeah? But the black line's growing a lot over time as well. So we shouldn't be too comfortable. The dip, by the way, in the red line is just really reporting lags for Chinese subsidies. So by the time our team is fed in the latest data for 2021 and 22, expect the red line to be back up to being around 85%. So at the moment, the democracies have taken steps which cover their trade of about 2/3 of their trade is covered by some type of trade distortion. The autocracies, it's around 77%. When we get the latest data in, it'll probably be around 85%. So neither of these are particularly well-behaved members of the trading system. And so it does beg the question whether they should be criticizing each other, hence the title of the talk. So who are the good guys? Well, the good guys are all the people who can't afford the subsidies, right? And that's everyone else. And so what I've done in this chart here is to show the share of global goods trade, share of goods trade into countries which are not the autocracies and not the EU and the G7. That's the blue line. And in the blue line, you can see that, yes, some of their trade is distorted, but it's only 1/3 of their trade which is currently distorted compared to 2/3 for the EU and the G7. And so the good guys here are the people who can't afford the subsidies. Basically, they are forced to compete in other ways. So as David highlighted, I live in Switzerland. Switzerland can't afford to compete with the EU subsidies. So they scratch their heads and say, right, how can we compete? Well, we'll have the best infrastructure. We'll have the most seamless telecommunications. We'll try and train our people as best we can. And we'll make sure the business environment is as good as it can be. And that's the basis upon which they want to compete. The small countries can't really afford to play these games. Okay? And so I think one of the things we'll see as we go forward with globalization is a difference between the big players which will use lots of subsidies and continue to use them, and the smaller players who will have to get their supply sides of their economy together, or to put it more bluntly, who will have to have very, very business-friendly environments if they're going to be able to compete. So I think that's one big takeaway from this chart. One last piece of evidence before two last pieces of evidence before I wrap up. There was a lot of talk over the last 5 years amongst us trade people about sectors where there's lots of excess capacity. And the story goes like this. China has grossly subsidized the expansion of firms in many sectors, and this has driven out production around the world and has caused a massive problem in the trading system. The US-China Economic and Security Commission has a list of sectors which they think China has distorted. I took that list of excess capacity sectors, and then I looked across the G20 to see which G20 members subsidize those sectors the most. And again, the measure is how much of the imports into those sectors compete against local firms with subsidies. And I also asked the question, well, look, if Chinese firms are being subsidized and they're exporting a lot, maybe the importing countries put up tariffs to try and push out those imports. So what do we find when we look across the G20? Well, on the left-hand side, you see that when it comes to subsidizing excess capacity sectors, as of the last G20 Leaders Summit, when we put this fact book out, the country that has subsidized the most on this metric is the United States. It's not China. Okay? It's not China. And there are other countries too. The EU, Russia. China comes number 4, don't get me wrong. But in terms of trade coverage and trade distortions, the US tops that particular contest. And in terms of reacting to excess capacity by raising trade barriers, then the US is fourth, but it's beaten by Indonesia, Argentina, and India, who are more keen to raise barriers to keep out imports in these excess capacity sectors. This is not the story which did the rounds in the G20 and in Washington and in Brussels and in Tokyo for about 5 or 6 years. The story was China was the subsidizer, the rest of us were all taking defensive action. Okay? And what I hope this chart shows is that having some respect for the underlying data and facts helps you navigate, at least think through the various claims made that some types of economic systems are inherently worse at distorting trade than others. So that's, this brings the analysis into even the more sensitive sectors. Then, in order to sort of explain what's going on here, why is it that we're seeing so many subsidies, and especially subsidies to specific firms? The reason, I think, is it can be understood as follows. Subsidies to specific firms are convenient for both the firms and for politicians. Why? A firm wants to receive a subsidy for itself, not for its own sector, because this gives it a commercial advantage against its domestic rivals as well as its foreign rivals. A tariff, if you go to Washington and ask for a tariff, the tax on imports is raised across the board. So you may benefit from a tariff that you've asked for, but so do all your rivals. So if you want to have a leg up over your domestic rivals as well as your foreign rivals, ask for a subsidy. Politicians like subsidies, or at least officials like subsidies, because it enables them to pick and choose who they're going to favor. Right? So they can have everyone at their beck and call. And so for this reason, the reason I think we see the expansion in so many firm-specific subsidies in the trading system is because the firms which lobby and acquire those subsidies find them useful for beating off domestic rivals, not just foreign rivals, and it gives politicians another tool to play with. So that's why I think we've seen many more subsidies than resort to tariffs. Now, of course, Donald Trump did use tariffs a lot, and that's because I think he had a different logic in mind. He wanted to whack China, and importantly, he wanted to be seen to be whacking China. Okay, that's a different motive than the one we have here. One more slide. Since we're talking about the movement towards potential blocks in the trading system, one question we asked ourselves last year at the time of the G20 summit is, do democracies hit each other's exports more or less than they hit autocracies? Now, this is a fairly complex chart, but let me just explain the key point. Let's take a country like, say, Argentina. Suppose it imports 70% of its goods from democracies. When you look at who Argentina hits in terms of imports, are 70% of the goods that they hit more from democracies or autocracies? So how does the percentage that they import compared to where they import it from? And what you find is that for China and the United States, they import roughly about 70% of their imports from democracies, and they hit 70% of the 70% of the protectionism they have targets democracies. So it's pretty balanced. For most other countries, though, especially democracies, they hit other democracies' imports more frequently than they hit autocracies. So the democracies have inherited a legacy of hitting each other's exports much more than the autocracies. The autocracies don't hit democracies that much. So if you're going to put together a coalition of democracies, the first thing they should be doing is unwinding some of the protectionism between themselves. Okay? And this is a point which I don't think has really been taken on board. So the build-up of this protectionism has suggests that if you put a group of democracies together in a room, they might have more to squabble over than fighting over Chinese trade. They'll be fighting over each other's trade policies. Okay? So that suggests that that type of fracture might not work. Let me just wrap this up in the short time that I have available. Subsidies are the name of the game. That's what governments have been using a lot. They are an important source of trade tensions and will continue to be. There is a lot of lip service to regional and global trade rules, but it is just that, it is lip service. There's very little in terms of underlying discipline left, and this is likely to continue. What does this mean for businesses on the ground? It means that most businesses now realize that competition is no longer on the merits. They have to wonder if a competitor, domestic or foreign, has their hands on a subsidy or not. And in terms of where the trading system is going, there's lots of talk about fracture along democratic versus autocratic lines. But if anything, the democracies hit each other much more than they hit the autocracies. And so this would require a big shift in behavior. Thank you very much.